The connection was lost, but I'm back. Yeah.
Good. So maybe Emanuela, just tell me when I can start somehow. Okay. All right. So welcome everybody. I see numerous people present here today to a digital talk about cultural commons and urban dynamics, product of a recent research collaborations among many of us present here today. I have received my hard copy of the book, although we are all digital, so I'm going to just leave the floor to Ario Klamer, Professor Klamer from Hilversum, the Netherlands, who will be so kind today to manage this discussion. And that's it, I guess. You will present the other speakers, right, Ario?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Let's start. Thank you, Valeria, and welcome to everyone participating in this symposium to celebrate the book on the comments that Miguel and Valeria and I forgot the third name have prepared. And that was also based on a conference, sorry, that was Emanuela, that the three of you have prepared based on a conference that I also participated in, that took place still before the corona crisis. And it was interesting at the time to sort of enter this discussion about the commons, particularly focusing on the cultural sector. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion because it will be interesting to sort out what it is that we mean by that and what it can contribute to our discussion of the role of culture in society. I think that's also how the editors framed the book, because they also note in their introduction that this is timely. And that in the current time, also with the current situation, this new intervention is called for. So let's see what they mean by that. And let's also see what that implies for all of us interested in the role of the cultural sector in society today. What I propose to do is that we start off with, I think it is Valeria's three contributions by Erwin Dekker, Trilzer, Navarrete, and Natalia Duarte. Speaking from the Netherlands, I think two of them, and from Colombia. And I suggest we start with Erwin Dekker. Each one will speak for about 5 minutes. Followed up by each presentation by a few questions. I will limit them to a few questions because I prefer that we first have the presentations and then we'll enter a general discussion where also the editors and the authors of the book can join in. So let me first direct the attention to Erwin Dekker. Sitting in the office that I once also occupied at Erasmus University. Erwin is and maybe important note also is about to publish, I think, a book also on the subject of the commons. So it is interesting also to hear from him what his book that he has edited does compare to the book that we are celebrating now. Erwin is an historian of thought, wrote about Austrian economics, just finished a biography of Jan Tinbergen, and does a lot of things in among others fields, cultural economics. So Erwin, why don't you go ahead and give your point of view?
Thanks so much, Arjo. Wonderful to be here. Also, again, Michaela, Valeria, very much congratulations on the book. I read it with great pleasure. And like Arjo indicated, I am about to publish, or it's going to take 6 months or so, but a book called Governing Markets as Knowledge Commons. And so indirectly, that's very much the perspective that I am going to say something about your book. So I think I start from a puzzle, or to me, one of the biggest puzzles of our modern time. So we live in a knowledge economy, and we have been doing so for quite a while. I'd say somewhere around 1980 or 1990, the knowledge economy became dominant. And it's also around the time that an important demographic trend in many Western countries reversed. Up until that point, people were moving out of cities, and ever since then, people are moving back into cities. There's urbanization. And that is strange because you would think, well, industrial or service, even a service economy requires people to be together to produce or to deliver the service. Right? Your barber has to be in the same place that you are. And this seems not to be the case for the knowledge economy, which can be done online as we now do it, but even back then could have been communicated with all sorts of other modes of communication, right? And those modes of communication have only improved ever since then, and people have only moved into cities more and more. So it's a very odd trend, those two things together. The clearest reflection of this fact is perhaps that property prices in cities have been continuing to rise and are still doing so. Right? As an economist, I've always wondered what explains this fact. Why is it that individuals and families are willing to pay such a premium to live in cities? Richard Florida, I think, in some sense, offered an example to this puzzle, and he said that people basically want to live in cities because consumption is better in cities. So you can go to fun museums. There's much better theater in cities, and the concerts are more exciting. I don't find that explanation very convincing. After all, it's easy to travel into the city from the suburb on the weekends to enjoy some good consumption. And if you look at holiday patterns, people are basically willing to travel for leisure all over the world. So why would they not do so at home? So I think the real reason, as so often in economics, is to be found on the supply side. The unique feature that modern cities offer the knowledge worker is knowledge of others, the knowledge that others have and that they can plug into. So the knowledge is basically contained in the other individuals, and in order to have access to it, they have to be close to those other individuals, and that's what cities are. So the modern city is a complex fabric of interdependent knowledge workers, in my perspective. But with one complication, most of them only know a few others, right? So cities are also anonymous. You don't have connections to most of the other people living in a city. So what is going on in most modern cities is a kind of complex dance in which everyone is looking for the right partner, but you don't know who you're going to dance with next, right? So there's enough overlap in the knowledge to be able to engage with others in a meaningful exchange, but also enough difference between everyone. Right? And it's therefore, I think, no coincidence that the practice of speed dating is as common for singles in the city as it is for knowledge workers, who also love to organize speed dates with one another. So, and most of the connections that you build there, both relation-wise and work-wise, are at best temporary. That is why firms in cities are less permanent and more project-based, and why significant portions of these knowledge workers are self-employed, right? They basically are the firm. So they are looking for new matches all the time. And for that, they need to be close to other people that they can match with. Nearly a year of working from home has taught us all this simple lesson. Working from home is quite productive for projects that are already underway. In fact, there's less distraction and more focus, so we get those projects done more easily. But there's no small talk and no serendipity at all. No casual run-ins. So if working from home is still productive, I think it's mostly because valuable connections were made pre-COVID, but that might well be drying up soon. So why is all of this important for a panel on the commons? I think the answer to that question is quite simple. What looks like a very complex system of interdependent individuals dancing with one another on the ground floor is conceptually best understood as one giant knowledge commons. So the city is perhaps the most important resource for the knowledge economy. The question is, of course, how we can best understand that knowledge commons and how we can get a grip on it. And I think the book does a great job in providing all sorts of handles to do that. In my own work, I've suggested that the one way of thinking about it is that it functions like a kind of social infrastructure on which individuals rely. Except that this type of infrastructure can never be publicly provided because it is governed by the same individuals that live in those cities, right? You cannot manage the people in that sort of micro way, although you can provide important places for them to meet and so on. And by using this infrastructure, by making the connections, these individuals also contribute to that infrastructure. So in a sense, you are the road that other people rely on the same way that the other people are the road that you rely on. So in important ways, this is a self-sustaining infrastructure, right? In the same sense that commons sometimes are self-governing. But perhaps that's a little bit too simple. Cities, of course, do have particular qualities and they do compete with one another, right? So you want to live perhaps in one city rather than another. And some physical infrastructure is part of that. And so thinking about cities of pools as knowledge, we also have to think about the other people living there and why people want to live there and not somewhere else. So if you think from a policy perspective, I think that's relevant. So what you're paying for when you're renting a nice apartment in a modern city is access to a pool of knowledge, right? And to me, that's also the major challenge for thinking about the commons in a city, how it interacts with the private economy. So let me conclude with a few thoughts on that. If you look well, the commons are everywhere in a city, and often they are entangled with private economic property and action, right? Example one, the apartment that you share. Once upon a time, this was only done by students who could not afford anything else. But now more and more people live in shared spaces in cities. Is that cheaper? Well, only if you discount all the nuisance that those roommates and flatmates bring to you. Is it more productive? Absolutely, because those flatmates themselves and their friends are all potential matches in your dance in the city. So in a sense, the commons start in your living room. Example two, the coffee shop and your co-working space. Little has to be added. I think much has been said about these spaces, but they're privately provided spaces that at once allow for work and for possible matches. So they're also very important. So these private enterprises are very important for making the commons happen. Example three, cultural spaces, often publicly provided, although that need not be the case. They're ideal for meeting others. In some sense, they bring us back to the 19th century theater, when people visited it more to be seen by others than to look at the art. This is perhaps best illustrated by the layout of those theaters, which always had important separate boxes or lodges, right, in which people could be seen and look at others rather than look at the stage. In that sense, we perhaps also must imagine cultural sites in modern cities as meeting spaces more than as only about the content. So to make them attractive, we should think about how they can facilitate interaction and exchange rather than merely how we can think about staging the art that is there. And of course, the clearest example of the commons in a city is the cluster, right? Firms are close together. They do not integrate, but form temporary connections. Together, they form what are sometimes called industrial commons. It highlights the extent to which the modern economy is not merely a system of interdependent individuals, but also of cooperation through contributions to this urban fabric that I think we can look at as a knowledge commons. Thanks.
Thank you, Erwin. So you make a connection with the concept that is central in your book, the knowledge commons. That's one question that I would have to you. Do you then equate knowledge commons with cultural commons? Or do you think there is a difference between the two? That's one question that I have to you. And then you, interestingly enough, have show us you could make a connection with urban centers, because that's very much in the book that we now discuss a central theme. And you suggest that that's through the living room, through the coffee shops, through the cultural space, through the clusters. We also in not only socially, but also physically sort of realize these commons, something that's what you seem to suggest. Now, my question would be, is, of course, cities vary quite a bit. I live in a provincial town. I don't know anyone in this city who is doing what I'm doing. I know you. I know people in Erasmus who do so, which is in Rotterdam. I know people now in Rome. We are scattered all over the world. So my question is, and that same applies, I think, for, maybe more so for the knowledge commons than the culture commons. What then is then the relevance of the city still? I don't think I need Hilversum, my own town, for the knowledge work, or that, for that matter, culture work that I'm doing. So these are two common questions that I have, just for clarification, and maybe you can briefly comment on it. In the meantime, I'm looking for other questions that are there. You might, if you have a question, please enter that also to chat, because then Valeria can see that you have a question, because now there are more than 40 people participating, and that's not, they are not all on the screen, and they are not all moving either. So we need to have signals from you when you would like to put in your question. But go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, so first on, I think the distinction between knowledge commons and cultural commons. So I don't think this is very, very different. In that sense that I think of the cultural commons, at least the way that I talk about it, right? A sort of resource, almost a sort of capital input into new production, is that in order to have that, or to have access to that, you also need to be where the other people who are making culture are. But in some sense, right, that is in the same way a pool of knowledge, a resource that people draw on, except it is now to produce new culture or new forms of art, rather than the sort of broader knowledge economy that I spoke of. I understand that in the book it's also used in rather different ways, right, for more specific spaces and places and communities. So, and I know in your own work you've also done this, and so I understand that at the ground level we see particular communities and individuals coming together and also forming groups, right? But I think if you do that sort of mild zooming out, in which you do see the city as a whole, it really becomes clear that it is a fabric of all these small commons, right? Yeah, you said that I've done some historical work, and I've studied Vienna extensively in the interwar period, and then there were about 100 circles with names. And so they were at the ground level, everybody was part of the circles. But if you zoomed out, you saw all those partly overlapping circles, and together, of course, they formed a wonderful resource that people who moved into Vienna could sort of tap into by becoming part and selecting what they were going to be part of. So what is the importance of physical presence, right? Why can't you live in Hilversum and commute to the city? I think that question is basically different for different generations. So I think especially people starting out and needing to develop all those connections, they will have to be physically present. And I think if you also look at who's attracted to cities at the moment, it's typically people between 20 and 40 who have to establish all these connections. And that also tells us something about the knowledge, that in order to have access to this knowledge, you need to be physically present. So apparently there's something tacit about it, or you only gain real access by contributing to it. Those I think are both valuable or possible options that I don't really have strong feelings about which of them is the most relevant. But I do think that the physical presence is very important. And basically you demonstrated that, I think, in your counterexample by saying, well, but I have to travel to reach these other places. And that's indeed what we do, right? And so if you look at the knowledge economy also as it's made up in the academic world, it consists of conferences where people go and meet each other, which in some sense you could say, well, all the science can happen in journals and we can do everything, send each other the research papers, but that's not what we're doing. So there's an important, either social or tacit element to that knowledge, and that makes it really important to actually be in the physical place, and to also have places where that can take physical spaces where that can take place, right? So I think part of the trouble with Hilversum might be that there's not enough, that there's not a whole lot of meeting places either where you can casually run into one another, and then but okay, I'll stop it there.
Okay, thanks. I see one question from Nicolaas, but I prefer to defer to later, because that's about the private commons, but that's not exactly what Erwin was talking about. And I don't see any other question. Valeria, do you see?
No, I only have Nicolaas' question for now. More will eventually come. I guess it's a good choice for me to wait until the end of all the speakers have presentations. I guess.
And then, so therefore, I would like to move on to the contribution of Trilzer. Trilzer Navarrete, we know each other because you also followed the program at Erasmus, the master, and then she went on to get a PhD and specializing, and now she is the expert in digitization in the world of museums. So I'm very curious, Trilzer, how you relate to this notion of the cultural commons, and how do you receive the book that's being presented today?
So thank you, Arjo, and thank you, Emanuela, Valeria, and Michele, for this very interesting book. Yeah, I think I can use quite a bit as I'm writing about the digital commons. So Valeria asked me if I could be here in this panel and say a little bit about myself. So here I go. So I started working with museums about late 1990s, when it was very hip to get a website. And so then I got working into the digital side of museums, digital museums. And since then, I've done quite some research and work in several areas. So administration, the use of computers in the back end, for presentation, either computers on the exhibition halls or online. And for some more robust, larger projects, you see this collaboration of institutions where they look at AR, VR, and now the machines learning. In the early 2000s, there was a very nice project that an app where you could search for all of the faces in the collections of the Rijksmuseum. Fantastic. That app didn't have enough resources to be preserved, so it's no longer accessible. But the memory is there. And so now you see a lot of other artificial intelligence projects going on between different institutions. An interesting project I was involved in was the mapping of the digital commons. So how much of European collections are available online? I was surprised that it was 10%. So we know that museums have limited walls, preventing them from exhibiting all of their collections. I was very surprised that only 10% of collections were available online. There's no restriction of space. What happened? So I did some research asking managers and institutions what was going on. There's some legal restrictions, some unsureness about how to go on with this new technology. But what I wanted to share here is this. I forgot to share this link. And so, I'll have to do it in a minute. I can multitask. I did a video for one class I prepared last year about the commons. And what I focused on was slightly different than what Erwin just presented on knowledge. But what I want to propose is this heritage information network as our commons. We know from economics that commons are non-exclusive. At a digital collection, we understand that once you put it online, even after firewalls and all sorts of security, people will get to it. And what they do is wonderful. So I did a study on how our collections used in Wikipedia. And it's wonderful to see paintings from a museum in a scientific article on psychology or economic topic on labor safety. And so this is how I envision this digital heritage commons, a pool where we all contribute with our stories, our contextualization of collections to explain, what can you do with this common heritage information network? Goodness, so you could use it as a base and a structure to define our present. Who are we? Maybe where are we going? It brings an inspiration for innovation, not only in creative level for the arts, but also scientific. We have lots of science museums. It can be used as a resource for learning and development. Now, during the pandemic, we saw museums, materials very well used for children stuck at home. It's a representation of ideals and for identity forming. And I can go on. When we say these goods are non-exclusive, I was looking at the book to see how other authors presented this rivalry. In a physical way, I think the rivalry is a little bit different. When you bring this at a digital level, first of all, the place is different. It becomes this virtual place like we have now. We're all in different places physically, but virtually we're brought together. The problem then becomes a rivalry of attention. So 10% of collections of European museums are available online. It's only 10%, but that amounts to over 300 million objects. That's quite a bit. Of those, how many are there used? So my research points to a very tiny amount. The long tail is quite severe. So a minute fraction get viewed, used, and reused. So clearly we have the problem of the rivalry of attention. You could argue as well that digital has rivalry in terms of what you, let's say, with the environment, that if you give bits and bytes to some objects, you might be preventing others to be on a digital place. But I think the rivalry is clearly from the resources perspective. When you give attention to certain goods, the digital goods, you will ensure migration so that, or emulation or whatever you want, so that you can open this old file even after years, so that the content is not lost. And on the other side, we know that if you give too much attention to Rembrandt, inevitably many other authors or artists and content and in fact, this knowledge about our heritage information network will be neglected. And so this is the way I approach the cultural commons. Publication is coming up, but now I will just be able to share this link on a YouTube short presentation that you can watch later on. I can't hear you, Ario.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Trilzer. Yeah, I was. I missed a small fraction because I lost the connection, but then I picked up, and that also allows me to see and to make the connection with what Erwin said, because it seems that you, like Erwin, present the commons as a sort of a resource. I think that Erwin briefly mentioned it, it's sort of similar to the notion of cultural capital, right? That is a resource from which we can draw. Now, you, of course, highlight the common resource that is realized in the digitization. That makes all kinds of the collection, all kinds of scientific research widely available. But what's interesting, what you bring up at the end of your presentation, is this notion of rivalry, of attention. And that sort of intrigues me, because it suggests that you can make it all available, but that doesn't mean that people also click on it or make use of it or pay attention, as you say. And so, it can sort of be hidden there in digital space, not because it is not seen, it is not visible. So apparently something is needed, as you suggest, that that people relate to it. And that's the question that that Erwin in a way also addressed, but people have to participate in the commons, right?
That's right.
They need to, in my term, contribute in some way or another by paying attention. They don't pay another currency, but the most important currency, it seems, is attention. And the question is, how does that, do you have any idea how that works? And does it say something about one commons versus the other? Is one commons functioning better because it involves more people paying attention, or something like that? Yeah, that's my question, actually.
Yeah, the suboptimality of the content is always a pity, right? But the suboptimal use, I mean. But I think it's true that when you participate in the commons, you contribute something. But it's also true that not everybody will want to contribute, adding content, images, and so on. Part of this contribution of the Heritage Information Network that I propose has to do with learning. And so it's your attention to learn about this artists or content or stories, the heritage, because that's what makes it yours. So the contribution is not only in terms of maybe even clicking and viewing it, but really investing in it. And it's linked to what you say about this conversation and the investment of an individual. So there's these two levels, right? On the one level, you contribute, as we saw in the pandemic, people upload images, stories, and they make these commons of the experience during the pandemic. And the other side is that they have to engage on this learning so that it becomes theirs. And this is the part of, like lost languages. This is our common heritage, and somehow they get lost. Why? Because there's lack of commitment and perhaps a reflection of the lack of understanding that this is actually yours. So until individuals realize this is theirs, which is much easier in a city where you walk along, you meet people, you see it every day, the piazza, the fountain, this knowledge is rather abstract. Digital is also rather abstract. But I think the digital is becoming a bit more physical for people. So I'm optimist that this might change.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much, Trilzer. I see some other questions, but I think they also are more for the general discussion so far. So unless someone else sort of starts waving hands, I suggest we continue and go to Colombia, where we find Natalia, I hope that I pronounce it right, Villamizar Duarte. She is an architect and an urban designer, professor at the National University of Colombia. And she knows a lot about planning and design and urban spaces, the topic that's very much also a theme in the book that we are celebrating. So it will be interesting to hear from you, Natalia, who you, from your sort of urban design perspective, look at discussion on the commons. And the question is whether this notion also figures in your discursive practice.
Thank you, Ariel. Well, yes. I first of all want to thank the editors like Emmanuel, Valerie, and Michelle for inviting me to this discussion. It's actually very interesting. My main topic of research is public space. In architecture and urban planning, like public space is like a way we like kind of a title we give to the commons, you know, like a public space is a space for all. It's still, well, everyone should be allowed should be allowed to be there, but everyone is also like own it in some way. It's represented mostly by like a public ownership, but the most important thing is like it's for everyone to share. So I first of all wanted to thank you and then tell you that I really enjoyed reading the book. I learned a lot from different perspectives about the notion of the commons. I got like 4 main points about reading the book that I want to share with you. So the first one has to do with that notion of the public and private divide and the notion of commons. The second one is more about the cultural heritage and the commons. And the third one, it's more about like that notion of capital, innovation, and transformation in urban contexts. And the last one is about the participation, the notion of belonging, and the notion of empowerment. So public and private debate, and now like in urban studies, is one of the like the big discussions right now. What is public versus private? That idea that spaces that are public and not private anymore, it's kind of being contested right now. Like there's more gray spaces, the like emergence of spaces like privately owned public space, for instance, is like actually a contradiction of that relationship. And in that context, the notion of the commons seems to be like that idea that it's a common use and it's the collective use what defines the publicness of a space and not necessarily the property. So the notion of property is being questioned and is being like replaced by the idea of use, of a common use. What I found super interesting about the book is like when you understand commons from a cultural perspective and the cultural heritage perspective, then you see how that notion of commons starts being transformed by the culture. So if we understand culture as a fluid aspect of society, if we transform, our culture transforms and adapt, then the commons will have this notion of transformation over time. And you see that, for instance, with COVID. So I'm talking about from an architectural and urban studies perspective, we understand the commons as a space, but as Trilzer was saying, that space is now changing and we have a new way of understanding the public space of the digital world, for instance. So now we are understanding these privately owned spaces as Google Meet or Zoom as our public space, our space of encounter. But it doesn't mean that that brings me to the idea of the intangible cultural heritage. We are constructing this heritage now that is every time more intangible, but we are not living the tangible spaces. We are still wanted to go to those spaces, but as everyone was saying, those spaces have to be built through capital. And it's the social capital, the human capital, and the cultural capital that end up allowing the transformation of these spaces through the participation of the public. So now we have the public participation is essential for the commons. As you were saying, Ariel, people have to participate for the commons to exist. But how we participate, if we are in this notion of like rivalry, for instance, we participate through, and that's something that I was super interested when I read the book, is the notion of belonging. You need to belong to be able to socially construct that commons, either digitally or in a proper space. I think the case of the rock project, for instance, that was presented in the book was super interesting because it was like a testing how we can create that belonging, and through belonging, we actually make commons possible. Because otherwise, it's a concept that we all, as Trilzer was saying, we all agree we belong to, but if we don't construct the belonging, then there's no way we can actually realize the commons. And I will leave it there. Thank you, Ariel.
All right. This is very interesting, and I wish I had more time to talk with you. But let's start off with this, because you make the connection with urban spaces. Now, the most obvious urban space, and you talk about the transformation. That's also what you, and there you connect with Trilzer, who calls attention to the digital space in which we also realize all kinds of commons. But let's take it to the urban spaces, because that's what also in this book is an important theme. And while you were talking, I was thinking about also Valeria's work. She did her PhD focusing on public art, and her public art takes place in. She has examples of statues in a square, but you can also think about the street, and basically what I'm actually trying to get is the difference between a public space and a common space. And you made that comment, and you said there is this discussion, but I can walk through the street and feel that I am just a casual bypasser taking advantage of this public space. And I have no connection, I have no association whatsoever. But it can also be that in the streets I own a shop, or I am a frequent visitor where I know people, that the street can feel like my own. That's the belonging that you said. And that in some way or another I belong to the street. And that shows you also, because if something happens in the street, in the first case, I just will notice, and the other case, I will participate, maybe even intervene. If I see something bad happening or something good, I feel part of it. I will talk about it. I will, and isn't that so there is a different of experience. I'm just trying to probe and see whether that's right in your sort of discursive setting, that it's also a matter of how you feel it, that there is a sort of, you talk about empowerment, but I feel part of it. So the commons requires a sense of, as you say, of belonging. I just check whether that is right, because that's important for our discussion also of cultural spaces. It requires a sense of belonging, that my experience is different if I'm operating in a commons from what I do when I operate in a public setting or in a private setting. Is that right, or would you make a different distinction?
No, yeah. So I was actually like if you take the notion of the commons and the tragedy that comes with the commons, that it was like what Harden proposed, it's like the commons is the space for everyone, but also because nobody owns it, because there is no ownership on the commons, there is no care for it. So if you think about the cultural, I found what I found more interesting, like the notion of cultural commons means that you belong to that, like in some way you are attached, you have a sense of belonging for something that is part of that commons. So you either you are interested because it's part of your city, for instance. I think that was like one way that I saw along the book, that you were the urban space creates that sense of belonging when you belong to a place. But you also can tell that you find that sense of belonging when you are part of a group in which I can relate to the digital world or the digitalization of the commons. So what I was referring, I think there's a difference between public space, which is a category that is more based on property, and the notion of commons, which I find a category that is more related to the participation of the public in that space, either virtual or physical.
Yeah. Okay. Before I go to the editors, because I'm curious how they respond to what we just discussed. Let me first, and that maybe first is maybe to you, Natalia, a question that Marta Moretto asked. Marta, you can elaborate if you want, but it seems that you are interested in sort of the possibilities for policy. Whether it's possible that let me see, because now yeah, I'm wondering if any of the presenters have encountered interesting models of policy making in establishment and maintenance, management, fostering of commons. I'm thinking especially as physical ones. Collaboration and co-creation are always big buzzwords here, as it could be devolution, for example. How can policymakers support the benefits of commons effectively? Maybe that's first to you, Natalia. What do you think? And then maybe Erwin and Trilzer have something to add to that. But it's always interesting, of course, what politicians and bureaucrats can do with this. Erwin made the comment of self-governing, but Natalia, what do you make of it? What do policymakers can do with this?
Well, if you think as a common as that social construction, like the commons is socially constructed and you have to participate in that, then you have different levels of participation that can and start by the physical commons having like different testing, different ways of participation, involving people, creating that sense of belonging. And once that sense of belonging is created, it's people itself who's going to demand from the policymakers to make changes and create those commons in a way that are more related to the people than to the way they were before. So that's the relation between transformation, participation, created sense of belonging that can be transformed into policy.
Yeah. Erwin and Trilzer, do you have something to add to this? Erwin?
Yeah, so I feel quite strongly about policymakers mostly having to keep their hands off here, and that is true in a very real sense. So what I notice in a lot of policy discourse about the commons is that basically it means an organization or a public policymaker wants to involve us in something. Because they need our input or are dependent on our input, or to make the thing work, they need us. And so they say, now it's a commons. No. That sounds more like you're trying to sell me something or get cheap inputs. So what I really understand the commons to be are practices and pools of knowledge that people develop through interaction with each other. And the question of space is difficult. So I acknowledge that place, and I think this concept also plays around in policy circles, the notion of placemaking. But sometimes placemaking can simply mean neglect, right? When in Rotterdam is famous for its dance music scene, that to have that dance music scene flourish in the 1990s, they needed neglected spaces where nobody was looking, and where they could throw a party without somebody bothering. And so they didn't need somebody to say, well, we're going to make this big concert hall here, which you can rent. And then now we have a place for the commons to take place, because that doesn't quite function. So I really think that, the concept is being appropriated from two sides. We can also be critical of how private actors use this notion of the commons, but I do also want to warn against this appropriation of the commons for things that are really public, where the government wants to involve us, or sometimes a museum wants to involve us, and then they simply say, oh, now it's a commons, and just come in. That to me is not a commons. But
so that's also accentuating the self-governing aspects that you mentioned earlier of the commons. People organize these commons basically by themselves. I myself was a policymaker for a while here in my own town, and I felt that I felt more like a partner in these activities. and I could stimulate here, I could facilitate there. I could not organize it. I really was dependent upon all kinds of people taking initiative, doing things together. And it made me rethink the position of governments, municipal governments in this case. They are not the directors; they are also partners, and so on behalf of the community. That's at least that was my experience. Trilzer, do you have something to add to this?
Yes. So as I hear you, I'm thinking, gosh, is the digital always different? So let's see, regarding the feeling of belonging, I do not think you need to feel belonging to contribute to this common knowledge. Because you learn from your mom, you learn from, wherever, and you are contributing. It's again, very conceptual.
And abstract.
Then you have, yes, it's very abstract. Then to the question of what are some of the government models, I put on the chat that Wikipedia is a very interesting governance model. They have been working successfully for over 15 years for a website that is a long time, and it continues to grow, improves itself, and more people are being part of it. It's quite remarkable. Regarding other projects, I agree with Erwin that you cannot ask, when a museum says, I need labor, free labor, let's contribute, and you're part of it. These crowdsourcing or citizen science projects are quite popular now. And I agree that this does not make a common because it keeps the participating citizens behind the closed digital doors. They're quite carefully managed. And so, but what I do think is that governments and taxpayer money are important precisely for these large projects. When you think of the CERN physics or other international large projects, you do need investment from many governments, many taxpayers. The same with the digital. A museum can launch a small website, digitize their objects, and go maybe a little bit further. But to really get into machine learning and some of the innovative projects, a collaboration is fundamental. And this is where government intervention is very thankful to create this infrastructure so that it's just like light and internet. It's larger than us who's built this so that we can get together and share these ideas.
Yeah. All right. So you are, and that was interesting because also Natalia sort of made, I wrote this down about this sort of transformational spaces, and that you create these new spaces that you are focusing on, Trilzer. And that's what I understand from you, that it is harder to develop a sense of belonging in what you say can be rather an abstract space. And that's what I understand from what you say. And that when it is organized, then it is often behind sort of walls that you have to get access. So there is not, like you presume, in a common easy access. Then it wouldn't work that way. Do I get that right? So that you think that, but that's also a question, of course, in what sense you can organize in a digital space the commons as you would do in an urban space.
Yeah, so I guess as I discussed earlier, the commons participation perhaps has two variants for this digital that I'm envisioning. So the one is you contribute with content. For that, you must somehow be part of this group. Otherwise, how would you know about it? So there's some sort of belonging to Wiki or to another effort. But the other side of the commons is the learning, in which is linked to Arios, your engagement, or how do you call it? You need to give yourself in order to get something out of it.
Yeah.
And so, and so for these, I don't think you need to belong, because I think you can learn of things and be still a bit rejecting the group, or not necessarily wanting to be part, subconsciously even.
Yeah. Belonging was a concept, of course, that Natalia brought in. And we have to see now how, because now I propose that we continue first with the editors of the volume. And what I especially interested to know from the editors, and maybe we can just start in order and start with Emanuela, what you think that, having heard Erwin and Trilzer and Natalia, what do you think the book has to add beyond and above what they already mentioned? What do you think the book that you are presenting here has to offer? So we have many authors, other interested in the book, whet their appetites, so to say. Can we start with Emanuela?
Okay, thank you, Harriet. Thank you, everybody. I think our contribution and our book is very interesting under some point of view, especially because our book is a multi-perspective attention about a very interesting point, because the themes of the commons is treated by several perspectives, not only from economists, but also sociologists, urbanists, and so on. For this, I think this is a point of strength of our book. And for this, I want to say thank you to Trilzer, Erwin, and Carolina, Natalia Carolina for this moment in which our idea can be concretized. And I want to say thank you also to the participants to the conference of the last year, because thanks to their contribution we can able today to present our work.
All right. And Valeria, what would you say in addition to what we already said? Is there something particular about the book that we should know more about? And especially, I mean, maybe we are talking now a little bit about the cultural commons, urban spaces, transformational space. Can you sort of pursue this a little bit further, Valeria?
Thank you, Ario. Thank you, everyone, for the lovely conversation so far. Well, yeah, I think that the multidisciplinary perspective is certainly a strength, an aspect of strength of our book. This means that if one wants to approach the theory of commons, one can easily find so many things in our edition, but not just because we have so many backgrounds, from architecture to urban planning to sociology to different branches of the economics. We also have some artists who have engaged, and that was, I think, very hard for them, who have engaged to think theoretically, but with their own artistic practices. And I think this is not something that you easily find in an academic book. We also have a graphic novel, by the way, as a chapter. But from a more academic perspective, I must say that I find that many of the chapters of this book do not just give their own view on a certain topic, but there is also a concrete advancement of some aspects of the theory of commons that are much needed at the moment. So this is also something that I really take into good consideration about the book, that I find so useful practically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So both of you stress also the interdisciplinary character, right? That you brought together from people from all different disciplines. That's indeed an achievement to do so.
Yeah, it is, in my opinion, because multi-perspective, disciplinary perspectives are stressed a lot in the academia, but then you hardly find this really put into practice. And during those days in Catanzaro, I think that we have all perceived and experienced what that is actually like. And so the book is just a natural result of that moment. That, yeah, it's still interesting because we have those were the seeds of these commons that we are in a way creating, at least this as a network. So yeah, Irvin was right in his beginning, I think.
Yeah. So if you allow me, I move on to Michele. Michele, you are an economist, and an important source of inspiration, of course, is the work of Elinor Ostroms. She sort of got a Nobel Prize also for that work, but that still doesn't mean that economists have embraced this notion of the commons. I also doubt that maybe in sort of the context of the climate, with the notion of the common pool resource, except for there that people don't know exactly what to do with this. Now, you are a cultural economist, and now you are part of this project to introduce this notion also in the context of cultural economics. What do you think is in it for economists? I mean, what is this? What do you think is this going to add to our perspective on art, on culture, or in urban cities, on knowledge, on the museums? What do you think is important, and what do you think has been realized in this book?
Well, it's quite complicated. I mean, fortunately complicated. So trying to put together all the dots. The point is, first of all, connecting your question with the remarks given by Valeria and before, of course, by the colleagues and friends who actually talked about the issues. The point is, first of all, in a multidisciplinary perspective, the economist must abandon the idea of being either right or wrong. That's the first accomplishment. The idea of not arguing within the parish church to say you're right, you're not adopting the right model, etc. The point is we lose our compass, which is beneficial for the economics, which is, I'm curious and greedy about reading and catching the emerging flavors of many a growing number of economists who are in some way not anymore satisfied with the modeling and structured view of economics, which is good news. And going back to the book, the idea is, fortunately, our multiple discussion led us to many paradoxes and unsolved questions. For example, even going back to the question raised by Marta Moretto, the idea is about what public intervention can do. And the idea is there is a delicate threshold of going to the risk of over-regulating the commons. And connecting this to your question about cultural economics, for example, I must say in the cultural arena, very often the idea is to look for and to ask for regulations. How much a regulation can actually end up weakening or even destroying the real backbone of cultural production. Because initially we have a discussion about regulating what they define cultural enterprise, although nobody is really good at defining it with precision. But my view is, if you really regulate it, you eliminate both elements of cultural enterprise. It's not anymore a cultural enterprise because you are in some way saying you do this in a functional, mechanical way. So maybe we could learn in cultural economics, although fortunately it's various, etc., beneficial, but certainly we could learn a lot of useful suggestions about abandoning the look for certainties. And also the idea of sense of belonging, which I particularly like, because in cultural commons, Erwin was talking about the city, the physical living in a city as something generating, of course, further views, inspiration, intuition, also practices. And Trilzer was talking about the idea of sense of belonging. putting together these 2 points in some way, like a short circuit. The idea is, first of all, the commons based on knowledge and the cultural commons do not have limits. The point is, you can't say when they finish. While a physical common has a material kind of, borders or whatever, in some way, physical shape. We don't have a shape, and that's a positive because it's generating value in a progressive way until you accept and enjoy the idea of not having a limit. You can discover always things. But this brings us to another paradox, which is, while, for example, in a company, you normally carry out a practical activity, you can be strongly motivated or even demotivated. You can have disaffection for the producing thing where you are involved, but this doesn't affect your physical performance. While in cultural commons, of course, the degree of being involved in some way exerts a big impact upon the value generated by a common. So maybe this is quite important. Also, in Valeria works and chapter, there was also the idea of how do people differently react to the sharing experience like public art in urban space. And this is certainly a matter of degree, which brings to the further paradox, which is the dilemma between belonging and entitlement. So how much belonging to a cultural common you can feel formally or substantially entitled to represent it when there is a wide permeability and uncertain definition of limits and thresholds, which is quite, just to close it up and to tend to get the outcome of this discussion, let's think about the next book. So the idea is maybe we have a lot of dilemmas and questions. A further book can be worth working on. That's it.
Yeah, if I can push you a little bit more, Miguel. See, Ostrom, when I think of Eleanor Ostrom and her notion of the commons, I think about the common grounds. I myself have a forest in the neighborhood where I like to walk my dog and sometimes go with my wife. And it's very pleasant. It is accessible, freely accessible. But now with the Corona time, we get very irritated that many other people have discovered this forest. Because I prefer walking through the forest without meeting any other people. And now I meet lots of people. So the fun is sort of diminishing. But that has a lot to do with the physical aspect of it, right? What Eleanor Ostrom does is it is not just a forest, but it's also a resource. Like the whales swimming in the sea, they are a common pool resource, and I can fish for them. So do you, at least if you have a ship equipped for that purpose. And there's clearly rivalry, right? If we all start fishing, then there is a limitation, because that's very much the physical part of it. But what we are talking about, and I think that's really something different from what Eleanor Ostrom had in mind, is, and that all the speakers so far have accentuated, that there is something abstract, intangible, right? There is a practice, some people have used that term, that is sort of shared by many, but that, as you also point out, has no limit, right? Where does it stop? And also, where do you locate it? That's what's true for the knowledge commons that Erwin talks about, but certainly also for the digital space that Trilzer talks about it. And I think that also when Natalia talks about these urban spaces, they are also not necessarily limited to physical spaces like a square or a street, right? So are we talking about something quite different from what Eleanor Ostrom had in mind?
Well, maybe we are simply adding something more, which is the idea of when we talk about common pool resources, the idea is normally the almost automatic interpretation we give, and this is still related to the cultural economics part of the question you asked me before, is exactly, you think about homogeneous kind of reaction or behavior or practices. Okay, now just going back to stories. When I was much younger, I was living in Sicily, and we had actually a small pine tree. It was not a forest; it was a garden with pine trees included with our land, and it was private land, of course. Many people used to go there. Normally, it was couples who wanted to kiss or something like this. But I remember we were worried about the management, I mean, the action performed there. And I remember I was going up into this small forest, just saying, do whatever you want, but don't smoke, please. So the only worry was people smoking and destroying the common pool resource, although it was private. So the idea was we were private owners. We were admitting every possible behavior. Imagine every behavior was not aimed at, was not putting anything at risk unless you were smoking. So the point is, maybe what we could add to Ostrom, going back to pretending I'm serious, is how much we can actually accept and cope with multiplicity of practices, which in some way comes from the multiplicities of views, interpretation, and this is the intangible part of it. Admitting everything, provided it's not aimed at spoiling other enjoyers of a practice and action. So I would say maybe we should face the dilemma of multiplicity, which is, of course, in whatever common pool resource. Of course, urban spaces are typical of heterogeneous actions, and which could. And there, maybe more than regulation, it's a matter of responsibility. So people actually deciding I think that contrary to the mainstream view of rational people being egoistic, I think we are reasonable people and we can be responsible as citizens. So I would be, even as economists, I would be optimistic about the possibility of not spoiling common pool resources in urban spaces or in some way in land, etc. So I would say this could be something, a small further frontier with respect to Ostrom view, which is certainly more complicated the more society becomes multicultural.
Yeah, maybe I see a little a bridge possible to a comment that Verena Lena made, although she just made one comment, which is public contributions can be fundamental for the making of the commons. What I have in mind is the following. It's a discussion that's taking place in the Netherlands. We impose now the requirement to wear a mask in public. And the government has decided that. And now there's a discussion going on whether the people responsible to maintaining this requirement should be the police. And that only the police or those officers who have been appointed to do so, to maintain what is this public thing. But others, including myself, arguing, yeah, this is also a commons, right? We share this together, and we also should, as citizens, as participants in the commons, and you mentioned the word, the notion of responsibility, have also share responsibility. So if someone doesn't wear a mask, it turns out some people are unable to wear a mask because of some physical condition, but that we should speak to each other, because it's a shared responsibility. And then you have more a sense of a commons, right? That it is a shared space. Now, I'm just wondering, maybe it's a forced connection, Verena. I don't see you, but maybe you can speak up. But was that what you? Is that getting anywhere to what you mean, or do you meant something quite different?
No, I was actually referring. We were still talking about the governance of the commons, in fact.
Yeah.
And if I can add something to this conversation we are having, it's about property. I think everybody's very shy about property, but in fact, it's something, in fact, ownership more than property is really relevant to the making of the commons. And this is where, for example, the role of the public can really play a relevant contribution, can be a relevant contribution, because many times in many forms of common, the public is there to support the making of the commons. So yeah, I think we should be less shy when talking, and even let's say putting into discussion property. So it's not really a taboo in a way. It's really important because we can see that so many commons in the end have to quit or have to leave what they are doing because they don't own the piece of land or the building or any sort of resource that they are taking care of. And so this is where property is relevant and where we can really combine private and the public together and create different forms of governance that allow to own and to govern and to manage real estate or any other resource in a different way. I'm saying this because I have the experience of having studied community land trusts, and these are really interesting models where we can see this combination of public, private, and still the possibility of communities to speak their voices and to be there. So everybody in these constructions have an equal decisional power, and in the end, this really works because it's not anymore the exclusive power of the public or the exclusive power of the private. It's really everybody deciding together. So that was my yes.
Yeah, Verena, that was also actually the point that Miguel made with his sort of garden that was private but available to anyone. But you say you have some experience there. Do you have a concrete example? Because that's interesting. You say you should not be too worried about that there is the private property part. I am also looking at Nicolas Palacios, maybe that his comment sort of feeds into this. But first, let me see, Verena, can you give me an example? Can you give us an example where that works well, you think?
Well, this is what I just said, is a community land trust, for example. Yeah. I don't know if you are familiar with this model. No. It's basically a model of governance where you have together the public. For example, here in Brussels, you have the region of Brussels. Then you have, let's say, the neighborhoods. So we are talking about housing. These are, let's say, institutions, organizations that are created especially to develop housing. And the governance sees the participation of the public, which is the region of Brussels in this case. Then we have the future and the actual inhabitants of this project. So it's a sort of private, let's say, community. And then you have the neighborhoods and the local civic associations and community-based organizations. And in the General Assembly, which is, let's say, the body that takes the most important decisions, everybody is an equal decisional power. And I'm saying this thing on property because I was listening to the debate, and that's not the first time actually that I can see that everybody talks about the process of commoning and making the commons, and also any material, let's say, component in making the commons. That is actually very important, but is not enough because when, let's say, as I was saying, if the real estate or the resource is not owned by the community of users, one day even the public can say, I'm going to sell that building, I'm going to sell that piece of land. And this is where the commons have to quit and to leave. And so this is really a problem. So to work on property really means make sure that the commons can be there permanently, and we can really, let's say, establish a different way of managing resources. Otherwise, we are just talking about temporary uses all the time. And I am afraid in many cases this is not enough.
Yeah. No, I think that is an important point, Verena. It's sort of, when you're speaking, I think of all kinds of other examples where you have what seems to be a very productive commons, but then because of all kinds of pressures, it gives way, and then other interests take over and you lose the commons. So,
Yeah.
and so you say, and somewhere or another, by also have private property sort of established for certain elements that can strengthen actually the commons. That's an interesting observation. I don't know whether Nicolas Palacios, you made a comment earlier, is satisfied with this. I'm not sure whether you still.
I'm afraid that Nicolas has left the conversation. Okay. I knew he was running out of battery.
Okay. Then I would like to move to.
Okay.
I would like to move to the comment that Mariangela Del Vovo made, because that's a comment about the enterprise. That's Miguel brought that up, and you wanted to. You said there is a similar discussion for community enterprises, and you talk about the gray area. Maybe you can elaborate some on that. And you also contribute to the book. What is the connection with the notion of the commons here? And maybe think about cultural enterprises. You have to unmute, yeah.
Sorry, hi, hello everybody. There was just a comment to draw some parallels between other gray areas, and it actually, I just remember hearing about this notion of the community enterprises, imprese di comunità. There was some debate, even academic debate, a couple of years ago, and a book was written and some research was done. And among the other issues, they explored this fact of the being a gray area. So not defining, because of course there are pros and cons about that, but sometimes what they were saying was that actually not being defined allowed them to do and to experiment and to be more creative with what they were doing. And that's something that happens in the cultural sector as well. We find that culture and creativity and the commons and all these talks, since it's things that they are developed and they evolved and they evolve in the practice, then it is difficult to sort of put a label on them and put them inside boxes. And that's and sometimes we perceive that it is as a problem within the cultural sector, but it might be a problem and it might be an opportunity. Maybe Marta has something else to say about this, because I saw that she picked up on the topic.
Yeah. Marta?
Yeah, sorry. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, good. No, simply it was very much connected with this idea of sort of not really categorization, but how doing so would help or is helping in many contexts, trying to understand what is the impact and what is the monitoring across the years of some specific sectors. For example, I'm really thinking about the UK example where I'm living and working at the moment, and this really helps like understanding how sector and subsectors are evolving over time, how different policy implementations can help in fostering some of these areas and so on. So there is much.
Can you give an example of sectors that you're thinking of?
Yeah, for example, at the moment I'm working a lot with the games sector, video games. And for example, that really like understanding what is the number of enterprises working in this sector really helps like in creating policies that are tailored in this sense and supporting them in developing in the future. Similar also for example, the theater sector.
The theater sector, yeah. And then we talk, because there's two aspects to this, what you bring in. This notion of the enterprise, but also the relationship to this notion of the cultural commons. And so I'm curious whether you talk about games. Do you talk about the commons there too, or is that not appropriate, the term?
No, to be honest, it was not really related with commons video games.
But the theater sector more so or not?
Maybe it could be if you think about well, to be honest, that conversation was really much related to how do you define sectors and how things can be supported on a policy level. So I was also wondering how this could be applied to the commons. So, for example, saying that a city has a space or a structure that would give to grassroots organizations, for example. How is that supported? How does it work? What are the the most interesting things happening out there?
Aaron, you have something to add to this?
Well, I hope it's related. It's most directly, I think, at Verena's point. But I'm intrigued as well by gray areas. So I also tried to develop a research project called Gray Zone. So I very much connect to this theme. And so I think in Ellen Ostrom's work you find sort of a curious thing, right? Because sometimes we think of the commons as a sort of set of rules. And I think this is what Verena also said, that you have a sort of common ownership. But in some sense, she also says often these rules emerge and they remain very much implicit, right? And so the way we govern a lot of urban spaces, say riding the metro together, is governed by all sorts of informal norms that aren't really enforced by anyone, but that make the space usable for everyone. And this is true whether you're in a cafe working on your computer, right? And if you receive a phone call, you move out perhaps even. So all sorts of these things, these spaces are all communally governed in the sense that these norms are very important in making the places livable. And I think the first thing I always notice when moving into a city and out of a city is how much more you have to adapt to others. It starts in traffic, where there's a lot more people that you have to sort of coexist in the space with, but then it continues with noise. So you accept that the neighbors every now and then throw a party, and so they invade your space in a way that my parents would never accept because they live in a suburb and noise is unacceptable there. So these norms are in fact ways of governing space and the spaces that we own together. And therefore I like this notion of gray zones because they create a space where these norms can emerge, right? And where these communities can truly govern themselves. And so I object a little bit to the idea that commons is sort of a model that you can implement, but commons is often a set of rules that emerges, right? I used in my introduction the example of the living room that you share with your flatmates. Well, if you think about a space where there's a lot of implicit norms about how to use this, right, then that's a perfect example, because when to have friends over, who gets to cook, who gets to clean, and all sorts of these things are all sort of vaguely norm-based governed, and that makes the space livable. And I really see that as a sort of model for how commons function in a city.
And if I can follow up on that, Aaron, because that's what your comments inspire me to think that the commons has to be experienced as such, right? That I experience, and your case of the city is clear, that I experience that I am involved with others, and that we basically, without being all that explicit, share certain rules, certain norms, that makes this a lively sort of area with lots of noise, versus in my own neighborhood, where we are supposed to be quite quiet. And if you're not, and if your dog barks, you will notice. I mean, people will tell you. But that also comes to this notion that I mentioned earlier, because that's sort of also policy related. And Trilzer, you raised a question, and I want to get to in a moment, is that and now with the corona, is it a public thing or a common thing? Is this something of the government, or is it that we are doing this together? To me, that's quite critical. And I find, and I think that in all our countries, this is operating differently, because I presume in Italy that quite a bit of police enforcement is being applied. And here we are sort of struggling with that. Is it a show thing, and we wear masks, or is it a public thing, and that's something of the government to enforce it? Something like that. And I think it has a lot to do with the way we experience it. By the way, Mariangela is moving. Did you wave your hand, or I saw you an hand waving, but no, that was just your hand waving.
Oh, sorry, I was just putting the charger on my computer.
Maybe then turn to the question that Trilzer asked. By the way, I think that Zoom meetings last for about 1.5 hours, and then so we are beyond this time limit. So let's see what comes up, and then if we feel that we are fine and we have given all the attention to the book that it deserves, then we can sort of wrap up. But let me now bring in Trilzer, because you had this question about policy. Of ownership, actually. Yeah.
I guess a few of you were talking about this ownership and payment. And perhaps is then the question that you just raised, what's the difference between public and commons? Is it that you're aware that you're paying for it or not? Because taxpayers' money, that's kind of the principle, right? So this public space should be our common place. Is the difference just the governance, that we're not told what to do, but we decide among ourselves? I find this quite tricky. I think in terms of this digital heritage information network, what's clear is that it's a bottom-up approach, because the government is clearly not having culture anywhere in its visor. It's not something quite important yet. For Google, it's important. For many firms, it's important. And so they invest. But then you know where the rights go and where the revenue goes. And so institutions and researchers are getting together to advance sort of not an anti-Google, but definitely an option that is very much of us. And so I wonder if this is also with other commons, in that I think maybe we discussed this at some point in one of the seminars, in that to what extent when the government does not provide, then individuals get together and they devise semi-commons. And my question was actually in terms of the digital, because I mean, would you want to pay for something digital in order for it to stay? So, I mean, do you donate to Wikipedia? We all use it. Google uses it. So I do,
by the way.
Great. So you might use it without knowing, right? Because it's everything that Google does is because of Wikipedia. So it's interesting. Yeah.
But to me, paying for my contribution to Wikipedia is because I'm really sympathetic to the whole setup, and that they have not gone commercial. I appreciate that. But if that then also, it feels to me like a commons, because I'm not one of those who makes entries and really engages in Wikipedia. So, but I would think it's a common resource, right? Wikipedia is, in which lots of people voluntarily contribute a great deal, and makes it a rather powerful source, basically driving out all the encyclopedias. I mean, it's quite amazing. All right, so I'm just also looking at those who have worked on the book, because we have talked a lot about commons. We have connected that to urban space, but thanks to Trilzer also to digital space. Have we done enough to call attention to the way cultural space functions? Because that has also been, that is in the book. It is also was a big part of our discussion at the time during the conference. In what sense, cultural space is a common space, and that requires, because that's a new concept, where indeed we bring all these disciplines together to fill it with substance. Have we said enough about that, or should we do more? I look at the contributors. Do they want to highlight? This is your chance to highlight.
Can I try and do something?
Yeah, please, Miguel.
Because it touches, of course, naked nerves. The point is, which is by connecting the cultural commons on one hand, the cultural space on the other, discussion, and of course, experience of the virus, isolation, etc. And the point is, normally we're experiencing kind of new and maybe unexpected kind of practice, which is integrating digital and analogic dimension, which is something that I think it's another further paradox considering commons with a content. So the point is how much still we are, it's comfort for the analysis to analyze separately the analogic experience and the digital world, digital dimension. Maybe there is, also I perceive some very emerging small struggles to even, I mean, with no heroic kind of intention, but simply because it works, it generates value, and it's more effective to integrate the experience in both dimensions. And what happens now, I mean, in my experience as cultural consumer and consuming a lot of cultural in digital dimension, which I used to do even before, which was leading me to sharing physically the cultural experience. So maybe another further paradox we should in some way focus upon is exactly how in the future, not necessarily in what we define culture as a conventional definition, but in a wider cultural idea, maybe we should be more and more intensively leading our practice into be shared in both dimensions with a permeability between the two, which would be the new normal in some way. And I think it could be a good idea to imagine something like, you know, you were discussing before, like the distinction between public and common, etc. Maybe, I mean, I think maybe it could be a common is a public with a view. So public with in some way an orientation, which is something that in some way leaves us exactly in the idea of a cultural shared practice, which is something maybe much richer and wider and much more multiple than we can observe now in the present state of the art of the analysis. So another challenge for us, even as cultural economists.
Yeah, that's a nice point that you make, Michele. And but you say we should, but in a way, I think this is already happening right now. That you see that lots of arts organizations are exploring entirely new spaces, also digital spaces, to present and share their work, but also make different work because of that. I mean, it's quite what I see happening around me. All kinds of new initiatives, all kinds of new experiments. At the moment, also public broadcasting gets involved. A new channel is opened up. But people are trying all kinds of things. So in that sense, what Michele just argued, it creates all kinds of different commons, as I am witnessing. I'm looking if someone else, Michele is there again, if someone else would like to add a comment or make some final remarks. Trilzer, is anyone else? Then I don't see you. So then please put it on chat if you want to make a final comment. Trilzer, what do you want to add?
So well, I know I should not say this, but I am quite secretly and now openly happy about this pandemic that brought so much attention to the digital. I think it was seen with quite fear, as perhaps some people see numbers and economic models. So digital, not everybody's understanding it and willing to learn about it. But I think now we all realize it's not so difficult and it's not such a big deal. And it's wonderful. So it does have quite a number of, quite the potential. And I just wanted to thank Michele for this last comment. You went away for a minute, but did I understand correctly? So what you're saying is the commons then a public space, but with orientation? What do you mean this orientation?
Something still, it's a shared horizon ways, the idea of sharing a view, which is exactly the content of cultural sharing practice. So it's adding to the, because until a space is public, everybody can do whatever is not prohibited. if it becomes common even without any formality on this, but certainly it becomes common when there is a shared practice which is generated by a shared view. So, of course, we can define it. Certainly, it is something that more than a simple, and it's not a functional common, because it can be still pushing ahead. It can be shared through different kind of, say, communication channels or tools or whatever it is. It's not necessarily homogeneous. I mean, I particularly like, I agree with Erwin with the idea of gray areas. I like the undefinable ideas, which are in some way more fertile for us. So it's the idea of analyzing what is chaotic, magmatic, but fertile in not having an homogeneous and a block kind of behavior, which is fundamental.
All right. Thanks. I see Manfred is. You are open. Do you want to say something, or?
I want to talk about the future.
Sorry?
Am I open?
Yeah, you are open. Yeah, you are.
I'm open.
Microphone.
Well, I want to talk about the future of the project, and so I was somehow involved in the production of the book because I made the linkage bringer, and I want to talk about simply technical, not about comments, but how to go on with this discussion. And there's the idea that this Munich Social Science Review, this journal, I don't know whether you can show it. I cannot see my picture.
If you hold it up a little bit higher, then we can see it.
Yeah, I cannot see it. You know, so, but anyway, Munich Social Science Review will publish or publishes a lot of funny things, you know. And one idea is that the contributors to this book, you know, we're talking about this today, kind of bring their ideas in 5 to 10 pages out in a little note or kind of paper, and then we collect this material and we do a special issue of the Munich Social Science Review. For the Munich Social Science Review, just go into Google, you know, there's some, they all steal our material, so you find it somewhere, you know, because it's a kind of common. And so this would be the kind of idea I had, and I would like to invite all the contributors to this column, and maybe even some other people, you know, to go on with this discussion. That's all I want.
Okay, very good. Yeah, because Valeria already put in a reference, the link, so she's very efficient. So you find in the chat.
Know, thank you very much. Wonderful.
Yeah. So people. All right. Well, I don't see others, and I think we have covered a lot. I think that we are witnessing the production of a multidisciplinary project, which is really an achievement even in and of itself, if also it addresses an issue that is very much now on the frontiers of our knowledge explorations, our commons, so to say. Sort of trying to bring this notion of the commons that Eleanor Ostrom and so brought in to further that and to make it also relevant for the areas that we are interested, whether it is urban cities, the knowledge or the cultural spaces that we are focusing on. And I think that and I really commend the editors having done the work. I know it's hard work. It's not always the most rewarding work with authors who are late or have to do all kinds of things, and you have to send out forms and to make sure it's just a hassle, I know. So I commend them for their work, and I celebrate sort of the outcome. That, of course, is also the case for all the contributors. I'm one of those who said he would contribute and then failed to do so. So I appreciate all those efforts that people have made to contribute to this book. And let's hope that, and that may be also an encouraging to see how it's happening, that this book will really stand firm in this discussion about the commons and the further development of it, and will be a reference for those interested in the topic of cultural commons, knowledge commons. And that also hopefully will apply to the book that Erwin is about to bring in about governing the knowledge commons, which is very much connected to this work, including, of course, what Trilzer is working on with her digital space. And but I'm also interested in what Natalia is doing in her setting of urban design and urban planning. I think this is very fertile. And I think that we already witnessed that in the discussion today. I'm appreciate all those who have been following it and holding on, because Zoom enables us to participate. It's a great thing in that regard, but it is also too bad that you cannot experience the physical presence, because, as Aaron also pointed out, that also allows us for serendipity, for the informal connections and contacts that you have, that we did have at the conference actually, and that makes for more interesting conversation, which is difficult with a Zoom. But as second best, it functions well, and I think that we were witnessing of what it can do to sort of focusing the discussion and to figure out what this notion of the commons is about. I am just your servant here, trying to sort of moderate the discussion. I'm not a host. Valeria, you were starting it, so maybe you also will finish it.
Thank you very much, Ario, for your contribution to that. I'm very happy about today. I guess I can talk also on behalf of Emanuela and Michele that we are extremely proud, maybe a bit tacitly, but also like we can say it out loud. We are pretty proud of this endeavor, and especially we are happy that for me, for once, I have had like a million ideas for further research in these little 2 hours that we have spent kind of together. So I hope that I would like to thank you for all the great ideas that we have discussed, the conversations, and I really look forward for a next adventure together. So I will try to spam a bit more emails around you if I hear anything going on. Well, just a very big thank you from the three of us, I guess.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Before next book, we will meet again and produce it. Okay. Goodbye, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
So if we can get together whenever you're free, so if you can talk to me.
Ja, war schon interessant, fand ich.
Sich runtersausen und dann hast du schon mal den Lenz von Wiesbaden gelesen? Ich wusste gar nicht, dass Lenz auch eine Schriftsteller ist.
Contacts, we'll probably need a few weeks to do that. So if we set in a meeting in just before Christmas or something to sort of make sure we get that bit done, so that we can get the crowdfunding done relatively quick up and we can start that.
While we slowly go away, I will.
Yeah, I'm kind of muting the people who are on the phone at the moment.
A special thank to Manfred, who actually was the real inspiration for producing a book altogether.
Yeah.
So, Manfred, we hope to have you also in next conference, and we will work hardly to actually contribute to the Munich Social Science Review. I think it's a very, very good chance.
Thank you. Thank you all for your
really.
Hätten dich ja eigentlich einladen müssen. Hätten dich ja eigentlich einladen müssen. Was du mit Tanja?
Eigentlich war das eine Veranstaltung von Ario Klammer.